Life.Church created this podcast because we all need healthy conversations with real people. So this podcast is here to help you start real conversations with your life group, friends, and family. Now, on to the show.
Welcome to the You've Heard It Said podcast. This is Jason.
And Mrs. Allie.
And we actually have a friend here with us today.
Hey, Abigail. Hello, friends.
Abigail. So, a couple hours ago, you told me a story about your weekend, and I think it's just perfect for this conversation. So would you tell the story again?
Okay. Only because I think I know where this is going will I tell you this story and share it with all of our podcast friends. So this weekend, my husband and I sat down we have like a weekly meeting almost. We call it like a coffee date, and we go over like our schedule and our groceries. And because we have to talk about groceries, we have to talk about our budget. And I don't like talking about the budget.
We don't talk about budgeting.
No, I don't like talking about it. And so I had sat down and kind of gone over what we had spent that month so far. And I finished showing my husband my list. It was color-coded. There were comments made. It was a beautiful, budgeted list.
Were there labels?
Oh, my gosh.
I bet there were. I bet it was beautiful.
They were glorious labels.
How much do you spend a month on storage bins?
We don't talk about that part of the budget.
Okay.
So I finished showing my husband all of my hard work with our budget. And he says, okay, well, let's just redo it. And I said, excuse me? I don't want to redo it. And he said, well, we're going to redo it because we've gone over in some categories. We have some extra margin in this area. Let's just sit down and rewrite our budget for this next, for what we have left. And I started crying. Aww. That was my immediate response to having to sit and talk about our budget more than just our weekly meeting, because I did not want to sit and look at numbers. I didn't want to talk about income. I didn't want to talk about all the different categories of expenses. But we did. We talked about it. We sat on the floor. The cats came up, hung out with us while we did it. And now we have a new budget. And it feels very empowering.
Aw, so how did you feel after all of that?
Well, it was convenient because I had an appointment with my counselor the next day. And I walked into her office. She said, how are you feeling? And I said, I had to talk about my budget yesterday. And she gave me some really good advice that was super encouraging. She said that one of the best ways to feel better about talking about your budget is to keep talking about your budget.
It's interesting you say that, Abigail, because you get to interview our next guest, Alex, and I think it might just help the rest of us to feel a lot better about talking about our budgets.
Hi, Alex. Welcome to the You've Heard It Said podcast.
Hello. I'm pretty pumped to be here.
So we've heard rumors that you're a master at budgeting. Is that true?
To say that I'm a master of budgeting is a little bit awkward to hear, but yes, I think since I've been budgeting for probably 15 plus years or so, I feel like I've got a pretty firm grasp on that process and can kind of slice and dice my budget and my money the way that I want it to.
Most people think of budgeting as a bad word, but the way that you're talking about it, it doesn't feel like it's a bad word to you. So how did you become passionate about this?
So I was kind of forced into the position of really kind of having to pay much closer attention to my finances because I just felt a call to kind of full-time church ministry, and so decided to do an internship at my church a couple years out of college. And so it was a 2-year full-time internship, which required that I didn't have a job. On top of that, I had recently bought a house, so I had a mortgage. And so was having to raise funds on top of paying for a mortgage. And so that essentially made my finances really, really tight. I had to make sure that I was covering everything and able to eat and cover tuition and pay the mortgage and whatnot. And so that kind of forced me to really start thinking a little bit more closely about, my finances. And as it turned out, it worked out really well that one of the early classes in the internship I think it was called Stewarding 101. And the professor, the teacher was just super passionate about, one, financial stewardship, but just kind of biblical stewardship in general. And so that class really opened my eyes to developing that idea of stewardship is way more than just, managing your finances well. So it was probably a couple years out of college that really kind of jump started my budgeting career.
So you buy a house, you have this mortgage, and then you feel called to full-time ministry where you have to pay tuition on top of like just the regular things you need to pay for to live. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. And so it was kind of further complicated. So I had roommates in the house, and so they were paying some of the mortgage, but because of the way that I did the mortgage, it might be way too much detail, but I ended up doing a 15-year mortgage instead of a 30-year mortgage. And so that obviously increased the amount paid. So with all of that, what I was getting in from the people that were renting it wasn't covering all of my expenses. So typically you would like rent a house and say that, oh, that covers, your mortgage. But at least in my case, because of my specific situation, it wasn't the case. And so again, that's what made me like have to really pay attention to my money, because I was basically losing money every month on that house.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. So then you're in school, and one of the first classes that you take is Stewarding 101. And that's actually something that we have heard from a lot of different people this season, is this idea of stewardship. And so how would you define stewardship?
Yeah, I would say stewardship for me, the gist of it is managing what you've been given well. And so I probably add the disclaimer well, to it, because obviously if you've been given something, you can manage it poorly, and that wouldn't be what I would consider stewardship. And so from my perspective, stewardship is more than just finances. If you've been entrusted with a car, managing that well, it's just the idea that pretty much everything that we've been given, whether it be material possessions, our finances, our gifts and whatnot, like all of those things can be managed well. Managing it well means taking good care of it, being generous, helping others and serving others. And all of those things, I think, are kind of my definition of what stewardship is.
Okay, so you learn about stewardship, and then you find yourself in this position where budgeting is really your only option to make sure that everything is managed well. So what was that experience like? Did you get it right the first time?
Oh man, no, that was definitely a roller coaster ride. It probably took me a couple years, honestly, to really feel like I got into a groove. And in that couple years, I would, try for a couple months. I would get frustrated. I would quit, and then I wouldn't even bother budgeting at all. So yeah, it definitely took multiple attempts at it before it finally clicked for me.
So I know for me personally, I have been in that same situation where it's like I try to budget, I get it right maybe for a month or maybe not even a week, and then I feel defeated, and then I try and do it again, and it's like this cycle of just not being able to sustain or stay disciplined with the budget I keep, which thankfully has changed a little bit. But I know that you also
Nice.
said that there was this moment when it clicked for you. What was that moment?
I think software, like what tool you're using to budget, actually plays a huge, huge deal in it. I'm a guy that loves finding software that just fits like a glove. So like I've literally tried all the different budgeting tools and apps out there. And what I found that doesn't work are apps that are kind of more expense trackers, where they tell you how much money you spent every month, but that's the extent of what they do. And they don't really force you to cover overspending and make those type of little decisions throughout the month. So I used a ton back in the day. They just never really worked until I finally found a budgeting app called You Need a Budget, or YNAB for short. And the way that it has you kind of manage your money, if you go over, it basically forces you to prioritize and make decisions on where you're going to cover that overage from. So I think software is a huge aspect. In my opinion, find one that will force you to cover overspending in some way. It's another way to look at it is that envelopes budgeting, where like you would literally like have an envelope that's earmarked for groceries and there would be cash in it. And so you could only spend that amount. So it's kind of that approach, but just kind of in a digital front. So if you go to the grocery store with $100 and at the checkout, you're at $125, Like at that point in time, like you either have to get rid of $25 worth of groceries or you have to go to a different envelope and pull an extra $25 out. So I think that simple act of having to move money around and make a decision of, oh, where do I want to pull this money from, really forced me to prioritize like my financial goals and ultimately help me stick to the budget and have a better understanding of what I was spending money on. Let's say I went over $25 eating out, and my big goal is to try to save up for a vacation. Then I have to ask myself, is it worth spending $25 eating out and take that $25 from saving for vacation? And if it's not worth it, then that gives me more motivation to not spend the money eating out in order to keep that money towards the vacation. So yeah, I think that's probably a good way to put it is you're looking for a budgeting app that is essentially kind of like a digital envelope system where if you overspend, you have to take money from a different category.
I love how you differentiated between expense tracking and budgeting, because I think that's something that a lot of people run into as they start trying to quote unquote budget, and it's not necessarily budgeting, it's expense tracking instead. And so I'm curious, if someone is starting to budget for the first time, what are some things they can keep in mind?
Yeah, so I think a big one is what is a short to medium term goal that you have with your finances? And like I mentioned, like vacation, like maybe you want to take a vacation this year or you want to, pay off your credit card debt or whatnot. So just having like a short to a midterm goal in mind, I think is super helpful to write it down so that as you're kind of budgeting, you're spending money, every month, you can ask yourself, like, is this spending helping me reach that goal? Or is it actually going to detract me from reaching that goal quicker? So I think that's a good tip. And then also, I think a big one for me back in the day is I mentioned that I got frustrated with budgeting multiple times and quit. And it took me years to really kind of understand it. And so I think one thing that would have helped me back then is really having the mindset of the long game. That I think, especially when we deal with finances, we feel that pressure of like, oh man, like this is a big deal. Like I need to get this right, which is true. But I think having the long game in mind is budgeting, and it's a skill. And so it's a lifelong skill. So it's not something that you have to master in a month. And so I think having the mindset of a student is really helpful. It's like, okay, I'm going to start budgeting this month, and just having the expectation that it's probably not going to work out the way that you want to, but being okay with that. And then just learning every month, why was I overspending this month, and making adjustments for the next month, or basically figuring out like where you feel like your roadblock is, with budgeting. And then just the next month, trying to do just a little bit better.
I love the idea of the student mindset. What are some of the things that you've learned throughout the years with your student mindset?
Typically, like when we're budgeting, there's always like a couple different categories that I think we feel the most. So I think starting with those, few categories initially and trying to get your spending under control in those categories, would be a great kind of starting place, as opposed to trying to budget every single category, all your spending every month and trying to hit that. It can feel a little bit unrealistic or overwhelming to begin with. So I think starting with the 2 or 3 categories that you kind of need to wrangle your spending on.
So I know that sometimes budgeting can feel like this bad word, or someone tells you like, hey, you should budget, and it feels so restricting and like you're just being put in a straitjacket. So what are some mindsets or truths that we can remember that maybe you've learned through this process that would be helpful as we begin budgeting?
I think on the straitjacket kind of analogy is actually, that's how I felt early on. So I think a big mindset shift is just understanding that actually your budget is pretty fluid month to month. Your life is fluid every month. You have different priorities, different things that you're focusing on. And so in that same vein, your budget actually should be treated as very fluid as well. So it's easy to think I'm always going to spend this amount of money in this category every single month. but that may not be the case. And so being comfortable actually adjusting your budget month to month, depending on what you know is coming up or whatnot. And so I think that's also the benefit of kind of what I was talking about with, software before, like that allows you to move money around really easily. Then that makes having a more fluid budget a lot easier versus, basically just seeing at the end of the month, like how much you spent. And so I think a big mindset shift would be rolling with the punches, I've heard it said. So like if something comes up this month and it completely wrecks your budget, that's okay. Roll with the punches, be fluid, and then next month get back on or adjust the budget.
So when you're talking about our budgets being fluid and flexible, does that mean that I don't have to have mastered being a disciplined person in order to start budgeting?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. When I first started budgeting, I was the poster child of not being disciplined in the sense that whatever I wanted to buy, I bought it. Like I kind of adopted my dad growing up had this motto that he lived by where he said, if you like it, you buy it. And so that's kind of the motto that I had in my pre-budgeting days. And so it definitely took tries and getting up after failing to eventually, I do feel like I'm a disciplined budgeter now. But for sure, that was not the case to start. And I was a student for a long, long, long time. And thankfully, I feel like I've gotten to the place where I can now be a teacher in it. But it required a lot of small wins and failures along the way.
Hi friends, it's Abigail, and I'm interrupting this great conversation with Alex to tell you one of my favorite financial tools. I got married a year and a half ago, and as you can probably imagine, we had some pretty colorful conversations about money, specifically budgeting, savings goals, our debt. You get it. Fortunately, we decided to go through Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace University with our life group, and as a result, we were able to start taking baby steps toward financial freedom. We grew our emergency savings account, paid down debt, and most importantly, we learned how to talk about money and finances in a healthy way. Plus, since we went through FPU with our friends, we had additional accountability and people to celebrate with every step of the way. If you're interested in looking at FPU for yourself, or even to go through it with your life group, we'll have it linked for you on the conversation guide, which you can find in the show notes. Now, let's get back to our conversation with Alex. Imagine that we go back in time, and right after you bought your house and were having to pay for college, instead of realizing that you needed to budget, you don't. You never learned to budget. Can you walk me through how your life might have played out differently?
I imagine my life would be a lot more stressful, honestly. Kind of that like low grade anxiety that you feel like when something is going on behind the scenes that you don't really have a firm grasp on. I probably would not be as free as I am now. I probably would not have the deep appreciation for like stewardship and like little things being acts of worship. I most likely would probably not be nearly as generous with my money. I think the biggest thing is I'd probably definitely feel more stressed out in life. Like money is definitely something that if I don't feel like I have margin or like I'm in control of, it gives me anxiety. And so I'd probably be a lot less healthy than I am now.
It's interesting that when you imagine that situation, you didn't just talk about your finances, but all of those other repercussions with just characteristics of being generous and living abundantly or with an abundance mindset, and then also the impact it could have on your mental and physical health. What's true about you now that wouldn't be true if you had never taken the step to start budgeting?
I am definitely way more generous. I previously was a tightwad, I guess you could say, and just did not like giving money away. But thankfully, because of budgeting, I realized honestly that God has blessed me with more than I need to cover not just like the, immediate expenses, but even to be wise in saving for long-term expenses and retirement and stuff like that. And like, I've been blessed enough to cover all of that. And so because of all of that, I think I'm much more generous. I guess I've overcome that more selfish mentality and recognizing that while I am, quote unquote, mastering my money, it's not my money, it's God's. And just having, a better perspective to look around and see who could I bless, what needs could I meet.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When we talked about budgeting, you mentioned that you see it as an act of worship. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
One verse that has really kind of resonated with me is 1 Peter 4:10, that talks about each person should serve each other with the gifts that they've received. That reminds me that God cares when we steward things well. And even in the mundane things like finances, or like if we have a car and we take really good care of that. And so as I was able to get my budgeting under control, I can see that I have more margin to be more generous. And so then that is pleasing to God. And so then it really kind of just really helped me understand these little things that I'm doing. Like if I shift my perspective of I'm stewarding this to honor God, then really everything that we do, honestly, in life could have that perspective, whether it be where we work or the relationships that we have in our lives or the material possessions that God has entrusted with us. So yeah, I think really budgeting probably was the first thing that started making me realize that stewardship could be acts of worship that you wouldn't normally, think. And so I think Pastor Craig has mentioned before how him working out is stewarding his body. And to him, that's an act of worship of like stewarding his temple of the Holy Spirit.
I love how you mentioned all of those different aspects of our life that can be seen as an act of worship, not just our finances. One of the things that you mentioned were the relationships that we have. What have you learned about community and God through managing your resources well?
It's definitely connected me to random people that somehow discover that I've been love budgeting. And it's been really cool to see some of them like kind of have that light bulb moment with budgeting that I had, and then see how it's kind of genuinely impacted their life for the better. They feel more in control of their finances. So it's definitely connected me with different people that I would have not expected.
So my last thing that I'd love to hear from you today is any advice that you would have for individuals who are starting this process, or for life groups as they're talking about a topic that can feel kind of uncomfortable. What advice would you give to them as they start navigating these conversations?
I would say definitely in a life group context, don't be afraid to just share what your financial goals are and let them know that you want to start and stick with a budget, because realistically, there's probably many people in your life group that could provide some additional tips and resources. I think finances can generally feel like a very private, personal thing, but at least in the context of a life group where there are those kind of trusted relationships, I would say take a step of faith and be willing to be vulnerable where you're at with your finances and your goals. And then I think just reinforcing the student mindset, I think that is a really big thing, is just knowing that you don't have to figure out budgeting in a month, and being okay that this might take multiple months. And in my case, it took years, and that's okay. But being willing to kind of stick at it and, figure out what's working, what's not working, and then just kind of pushing through until finally, like there will be a light bulb moment, if you kind of go at it. And then at that point in time, like literally the world is your oyster. Like you will find so much freedom in being able to manage your money well and stewarding it well. You'll find that you're saving more than you expected. And by extension, that will allow you to be more generous and be able to bless other people. So it really is, in my opinion, a literal game changer.
That's great. Well, Alex, thank you again for being with us today.
So Alex said that he sees finances and his schedule as a way to worship. Mm-hmm. I think just think about that for a second. Imagine what might change about your life if you viewed every purchase and every commitment on your calendar as an opportunity to show God who he is to you.
Man, that is really challenging for me to think about. But I really loved that he said that. And I also really liked how he talked about using what God has uniquely given you to bless others, because I think it's really tempting to compare stories. Like you might even be listening now and be like, wow, that Alex guy sounds like he's really good at budgeting. But like the gifts and energy and life stage and resources in your life are going to look different from Alex and from people in your life group. And that's okay. And so you can apply the principles he talked about without having to compare the outcome, because obedience is the main objective behind all of this. And so like he talked about, and like John from last week's episode talked about, the key to all of this is having patience. It's not getting focused on what you see now, but being focused on what a lifetime of faithfulness can produce later.
So this is a lot like Proverbs 13:11. And in the NLT, it reads like this. It says, wealth from get-rich-quick schemes quickly disappears, but wealth from hard work grows over time. And I think you could actually replace that word wealth with a lot of other things.
Yeah.
If you spend a lot of time making it, then it's going to last. And so these principles probably won't produce anything like right away in your life, but the disciplines that they create will eventually make a huge impact, I think.
Yeah. And I like how it was always focused on other people too. Like it wasn't just gaining more resources or being a good steward for the sake of doing that. Like it was so that we can love others.
I was thinking about 1 Peter 4:10.
Okay.
About how we're called to use our gifts to love people in our lives. And as we talk about this, maybe you feel, or anyone listening might feel like they don't have a ton of gifts to offer. When we talk about our resources, this includes things like hospitality, like can you host people in your apartment or in your home? Can you cook someone dinner? Can you, maybe like Alex, share a skill, like a skill of budgeting with someone else, or you can mentor someone? There are so many ways to make sure that we're using everything God gives us in a generous way.
Yeah. So all of that reminds me of this really sweet moment where somebody was generous to me lately. So at my Life.Church location, there's this really kind host team volunteer named Vicky. And she didn't even know my name. Like I know her name because it's on the name tag. I see her every week, all the things. Like she's so kind. And she noticed that I was pregnant. And she would ask about how I was doing and how I was feeling. And then like the next Sunday, she brought this gift for me because her daughter makes these quilts for babies. And so she had her make this fox one for me, which is like the whole theme of my baby's nursery and all the things. But it was just so meaningful. And I think it's the perfect picture of like using what you have to bless other people.
Right. Like I think you'll probably remember that story like maybe even forever.
Right.
That's really cool. I think there's something about being generous with what we have that lasts. You know?
And so we've covered a lot of things in this episode, and a lot of it is practical stuff that allows you to be a good steward and to be generous with what you have. I actually use the same budgeting software that Alex does, and it's been really helpful for me, but you don't need a software. Like our challenge this week to you is just find a system and create a budget, however you want to do that.
And as you might be able to tell from my answer to the budget question of oof, that I used to be pretty resistant to having a budget. But I realized that, like, if you're not paying attention at all to your budget, to what you're spending, what you're bringing in, then you don't really know if you're doing it well. Like, again, this is an area where you can honor God, where you can worship Him. And a budget just helps you to know if you're doing that. So think about it even like a company would think about their budget. Do you like where the money is going out? Do you like where it's coming in? And what about your calendar? Are you using the resources and your time to serve God and to serve others?
And I mean, that's a lot of things to think about, but it's really important to think about them. And not even just to think about your own, but with your safe people. So like your friends or your life group or your family, talk about these things together and just ask one another, what values do your budget and your calendar reflect? And what would you change about them?
And you might even consider picking one other person to go through your budget with. So if you're married, you could do that with your spouse, but also it's a good idea to go through it with another couple. If you're single, you might pick a friend who you really respect the way they use their finances, or even a financial advisor or a mentor or someone you look up to. So yeah, pick someone who can really help you and challenge you to be the best version of you with your budget.
I like that. Okay, so one final thing I'll throw out there. Even if you don't use the software that Alex and I do, you should still follow them on Instagram. So it's at YNAB, YNAB, and every Friday they post high quality content memes. So just do it. That's it.
Thanks for listening to You've Heard It Said. And hey, if you're still listening, you are one of my favorite listeners. This is actually my favorite part, like where I get to do random things in the credits. So I actually asked Audra, who's helping us record. Audra, could you just tell them like some of the fun things we do in the credits?
Mostly you do fun things in the credits, like go off script and request an additional mic.
So she totally just had to like stop recording, turn on a mic. But anyways, I wanted to tell you about something. We want to hear your story. So we think that when something changes in your life or something changes your mind or in some way you're being formed, that those are the stories that God is telling in your life. And you can send us your story just by visiting www.life.church/mystory. And we'd love to tell your story in an upcoming episode of You've Heard It Said, and maybe you might even show up in the credits, who knows? So you can find that URL I just mentioned and everything else that goes with this episode in the conversation guide, which is in the show notes wherever you're listening. Thanks and have a great week.